Oh hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster, and today we are going to be discussing what exactly we are talking about when we say avant-garde fashion. Ultimately, my goal here is to kind of complicate this term a little bit, add a little bit to it, round it out a little bit so that we can have more productive conversations about what designers' work actually qualifies as avant-garde, and so that we can have more productive conversations about it in fashion generally. The term gets thrown around a lot, and if you just got into fashion, you might be fooled into thinking that avant-garde refers to a style of dressing, like as if anything that is moody or monochromatic or just has really big pockets on cargo pants, that this is avant-garde. And while it could definitely be argued that the principles of avant-garde could be applied to the way in which you dress yourself, because that ultimately is an art form, it's generally used in fashion to refer to the work of designers themselves. So either the presentation of a designer's work is avant-garde, or the final product that ends up in stores is avant-garde. The reason I felt compelled to make this video in the first place is because, one, fashion is pretty bad generally at defining our own terms and kind of sticking to them. And secondly, the term avant-garde is so complex and so rich and so useful for having good conversations about art at large that it would be kind of a shame if in fashion it just got thrown around as a loose descriptor of anything that seems slightly different. And I do want to definitely clarify, my goal here is not to correct anybody. That would be kind of a dumb, silly reason for making a video. I just think that we, mostly I, could benefit from having a more holistic understanding of what this term means and how it functions so that we can all have better conversations about art and fashion. Sound good? Great. Okay, so let's get some basic terms down so that we can better understand what it is that we're actually talking about. The term avant-garde refers to art generally. So if we look at just the Oxford English Dictionary standard definition for what avant-garde means, it says favoring or introducing experimental or unusual ideas. So this definition here is so incredibly general that it does affirm generally how avant-garde gets used in fashion terms. It just describes something that seems experimental or seems kind of unusual or is introducing a slightly new idea. I think we need to dig a little bit deeper though into how the term gets used in order for us to come to a more full understanding of how it can best be used. In her essay Against Interpretation, Susan Sontag defines avant-garde as, quote, experiments of form at the expense of content. Okay, so all art can be divided into two categories for the most part: content and form. Content is what the art is saying to you, the narrative behind it, the message of the art, the way it's speaking to you, the ideas that it might give you, the questions that it raises. The form of the art is just the way that it looks, the colors it's using, the shape that it takes, the way that it is presented to you visually. So in fashion as an art form, some examples of content would be the praise of contemporary working women in Martin Margiela's work, all of the societal pressures for code switching for gay men of color in Shane Oliver's work at Hood by Air, any message that is printed onto a t-shirt, Cerulli Recht causing us to question whether or not we should actually be using animal skins in order to create wearable objects by surgically removing part of his own skin and tanning it into a ring. All of these are examples of content in the art of fashion. On the other side, we have form. Examples of form in fashion are things like the classic bar jacket from Dior, a specific cut of jacket that they repeat season after season that has become a hallmark of the house. The hourglass bag. This is something that everyone knows to be a specific shape that is associated with Balenciaga. The J.W. Anderson zipper neckband thing. Basically everything by acronym, a brand that is hell-bent on the evolution of the form of garments. Savile Row tailors make their money because of years and years of obsessive fixation on the form of garments. Right? So we have content and we have form. Now, to bring it back to avant-garde and Susan Sontag's quotation, she says, experiments of form at the expense of content. So what she's mostly referring to is in painting and in sculpting and in most forms of art, you are experimenting with the form that the art takes. And usually that comes at the expense of storytelling or content. So in a lot of experimental film and a lot of sculpture and a lot of painting, when someone is described as avant-garde, they're not so much trying to tell you a story or highlight some kind of social situation. They're usually trying to push the art form forward by opening up new possibilities as to its form. Susan Sontag has written essays that are strongly related to fashion, like her famous Notes on Camp essay. This one was not in any particular way targeted at the fashion world, and I think it's really really interesting because this definition that she gives, I think, works the opposite way when it comes to fashion. Oftentimes, and when we're talking about this stuff, we do have to say oftentimes because there really are no hard and fast rules with any of this stuff for any art medium. But it seems like in fashion, we have the opposite. Usually avant-garde stuff is a super emphasis on content at the expense of form. These are heavily narrative-driven collections of clothes at the expense of form, or as we often say, wearability. Isn't that such a tricky word in fashion, wearability? I oftentimes try to just totally exclude that word from my vocabulary when I'm talking about fashion because it almost never results in anything interesting being said. Maybe though, when we're talking about avant-garde in terms of fashion, we have to split it into more than just two categories for the thing. We keep content the same, the narrative part of fashion, but then when we come over to form, we maybe have to split that into process and wearability. Wearability obviously being how do these clothes look and fit and wear on a body, and then process is how the clothes were made. Sometimes avant-garde in fashion is heavy experimentation with both, as with Iris van Herpen, where it's experiments with the content and the storytelling and heavy experiments with the process of creation, but again, it's at the expense of wearability. To bring it back to Cerulli Rect, it's another example of this. There are whole pages that could be written just about the process of how certain pieces by Cerulli Rect get created, and the narrative element of that is still very much alive. But again, it's usually at the expense of wearability. Some of his items literally cannot be worn without physically harming yourself. They're objects that did go up for sale and were purchased by someone and then have to sit on the shelf because if you put them on, in the case of the glass slippers, they will literally break under your weight and put glass in your feet. And in doing so, he plays with the content element of this by calling into question luxury items that are meant not really to be used. Another example would be Hussein Chalayan with his airplane dresses. These are gorgeous feats of engineering that they're able to work in the way that they do. And it calls to mind all of this narrative and background of Chalayan's life himself, where he was associating airplanes with all of these things from his childhood, this very complex narrative that he built over the course of his career in regards to the symbol of the airplane. And the process of making that thing was itself very avant-garde. He had to introduce all of these technical and engineering elements that would have never found their way into an atelier other than for the demand of, we're trying to make a dress that can transform into an airplane. How can we get this done? And then again, when you wear the thing itself, it's a gorgeous thing on the runway, but then the wearability element of it gets sacrificed in favor of the symbolism and the process that is done in order to make the thing. Fashion is a medium of art that is so bound up in its usefulness. Thousands of years of really good engineering has made it where fashion's sole purpose for the vast majority of people is just to function in a society. Then, so is avant-garde something where you have to give up one of these three categories, content, process, or wearability? And then whichever one you give up, do you have to then really drive home the innovation in the other two or just one? But then again, even that I feel like could be challenged in terms of how we're talking about avant-garde. There are a few designers where if we're unsure about everything else, we know that the designers that are avant-garde are Rei Kawakubo, YOHJI Yamamoto, and Martin Margiela. And at least in the case of Martin Margiela, you find an example of someone who was undisputably avant-garde but didn't have to give up any of those three categories. Martin and the rest of the team at the Maison experimented with found objects and clothing to create some of the most challenging work of the 1990s. One of his best collections featured vintage garments that were photographed and then screen printed onto plain, simple dresses. The way he challenged the fashion system with his collections was avant-garde already, and that's the content of what he was doing. He rejected the idea of newness and his emphasis on thrifted clothing in previous collections. This is all avant-garde in the first place. He then toyed further with this idea in this collection by creating a new print. In the past, all of his prints were found prints. He had thrifted things or found things at flea markets or in rag shops where he had taken those things and then put them into a high fashion context. So for this collection, he was creating a new print. And the way that he did that was by finding vintage garments that were designed by someone else decades prior, and then he set them up in his studio and someone photographed them, and then those photographs were printed onto blank clothes. This further pokes fun at the fashion industry's idea of newness, saying that everything is just based off of the designs of the past. But by screen printing this new print onto simple dresses, he checks every box. This is avant-garde in its process. This is avant-garde in its content, and this was designed in the mid-90s, but I feel like if this went for sale right now at Saks, it would fly off the shelves. This is incredibly wearable. This is a beautiful piece of clothing. And the last point of complication that I want to bring up here is one that someone brought up, just absolutely brilliant words on my private Discord server. And if that is something that you do want to join, it's the best fashion community that I've ever been a part of in my entire life. All you have to do is join the Patreon. You get exclusive videos like the April Fool's video that I made, the analysis of Philip Klein. You get to rewatch all the live streams, you get early access to new episodes, but I think the biggest benefit is that you get to be a part of a community where people are talking about the nuance of clothes in a really good conversational format. Anyway, this particular user pointed out the really excellent point that it seems like the definition of avant-garde is different for every generation. And I think that is a huge thing for us to keep in mind, that there are some designers where they start out and their foundations are very avant-garde, but then, like in the case of YOHJI YAMAMOTO, it's worth having the conversation, is this still avant-garde? Can a designer's vision stay the same no matter how brilliant it is for decades and it still be considered avant-garde in the present day? Or is it a term that needs to be renewed for a designer, where you have to, throughout your career, continue to dodge expectation and dodge convention in order to continuously earn the term of avant-garde? And they went on to say, this is absolutely brilliant. They said, quote, "I would say this entire movement of gender-neutral and size-inclusive designs may potentially be our generation's version of avant-garde." And that is such a good point. So basically arguing that avant-garde is a product of and a reaction to the cultural zeitgeist. So looking at designers like J.W. Anderson's work and looking at designers like Alessandro Michele at Gucci's work, who are continuously thwarting our conventional ideas of what men and women and just people should be wearing for their different roles. Also looking at designers like HANIFA, who do a wide range of size-inclusive products and also have very forward-thinking presentation for those products. So now we come to the part of this video that I think is the most important, and that is the conversation part of it. What is avant-garde? How should we be using that? What are some ways that we can make avant-garde something that produces more thoughtful and nuanced conversations rather than just a loose label that we can slap onto things that seem vaguely different? Is there an element of avant-garde's usage that you think that I missed? I love learning more about this topic in art. It's endlessly fascinating to me, so I am very open to being corrected or having things added on. I would love to hear what you think in the comments. Go sign up for the Patreon, support the channel. The only way that this can happen is if people support it in a very direct way. You also get to join the private Discord server. You get all the perks, exclusive videos. Go watch that Philip Klein video. It's hilarious. I'm actually really proud of that one. I love you. Thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to everyone later. Bye.